I encourage all of you to read our Code of Ethics for yourselves. I am going to interpret it somewhat, but I'll encourage you to read it yourself, interpret it yourself, and today I want to provide a context for our AAPS Code of Ethics. So my thesis today is that our AAPS Code of Ethics stands out as a patient-centered code of ethics, and that's in contrast to other codes of medical ethics which dilute the physician's loyalty to the patient by assigning conflicting responsibilities. I'm also going to argue that competing codes of ethics can be evaluated empirically. When the physician's practice is in correct ethical alignment, good clinical outcomes will naturally ensue, and the physician feels good about her work. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start with a brief review of the history of medical ethics. Then we'll go on to a line-by-line comparison of the AAPS code to the AMA code. And finally, we'll finish up with what I'm going to call an empirical critique of bioethics. So let's start with the case. This is a case from my own practice. The patient gave me consent to share it. There's a 64-year-old woman who's lived with type 1 diabetes for 55 years, and she's developed complications of anemia and gastroparesis. She comes into my office complaining that she feels cold, tired, and depressed, and these are all symptoms that were associated with past episodes of severe anemia that had to be treated with IV iron infusions because she has gastroparesis. Her hemoglobin is measured at 10.8. Medicare regulations do not permit reimbursement for treatment unless the hemoglobin is less than 10. What should the hematologist do? Okay, so what's the purpose of a medical code of ethics? Well, it's a point of reference for self-reflection and self-regulation. But I'm going to argue that a code of ethics is also a source of professional identity. So here in AAPS, we're not just the group that you can characterize as politically conservative or libertarian. We're not just the group that's constantly bringing lawsuits. We're the professional society that has a patient-centered code of medical ethics. That's who we are. Okay, now for a history of medical ethics to help show the origins of our code. We'll start, of course, in the classical Greek world. And around the 5th century BC, folk medicine and religious ritual began to evolve into specialized practice. And this practice is based on empirical observation and logical reasoning. And this learning coalesced over 5 centuries into a collection of 70 treatises known as the Hippocratic Collection. Medical ethicists like to talk about deontology and decorum in order to sound learned. So deontology is a description of what one ought to do, and these things are usually expressed in rules or principles. That's exemplified by the oath of Hippocrates. And decorum is a description of the outward behaviors that manifest inner virtue. The Hippocratic Collection has a lot to say about decorum. And one of the main points I want to make is Hippocratic values are directly derived from clinical practice. Now, let's jump ahead to the Enlightenment. And I apologize that we're going to have to take some time to talk about utilitarianism, but we have to talk about it because that's a very influential trend in the thought of bioethicists today and in American medical ethics. So these theories were popularized by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and here's some of the major precepts. Human good is understood to be constituted by whatever satisfies people's desires or preferences or makes people happy. God is taken out of the equation, quite notably. Actions are judged as right or wrong according to their outcomes. This is an outcomes-based ethical theory. An act is judged as morally right if it produces as great a balance of pleasure over pain as any alternative action open to the agent. And finally, and this I came across when I was doing my research, I wasn't so familiar with this part of utilitarianism, each person is fundamentally morally equivalent to any other, and strangers count as much as friends or family. So any favoritism toward one person must be justified by overall good consequences for people generally. Now, I think we're all pretty familiar that utilitarianism is routinely and crudely interpreted as meaning the greatest good for the greatest number. That's actually not what it is, but that's how it tends to get presented. The other important thing about utilitarianism, it does not allow for one person to have a special duty to another. Let's go on to Immanuel Kant. He was contemporaneous with Bentham, and it's not for nothing that ethicists like to contrast Kant to the utilitarians. So here's Kant's major principles. Human beings are rational and they can resist desire. One must act not for the sake of an outcome, but for the sake of an obligation. Kant had his famous categorical imperative, which I spell out for you here. Basically what it means is when good reasons support a moral judgment, those reasons are good for all relevantly similar circumstances. Wouldn't we love it if people in Congress actually followed this principle? Kant also argues that morality cannot exist without freedom. So one important thing about freedom is that a person should never be used exclusively as a means to someone else's ends. And Kant also promoted the idea that the ultimate end of all action is the highest good, and in his conception, the highest good is the perfect union of virtue and happiness guaranteed by God. So he's arguing that there's something more than just pain and pleasure. So I'm going to argue that an ethical system for physicians that's based on duty suits the patient-physician relationship a lot better than a system based on outcomes. Thomas Percival published his famous Code of Ethics in 1803. That Code of Ethics eventually became the basis for the AMA Code of Ethics, and the earlier versions of the AMA Code of Ethics eventually became the basis for our AAPS Code of Ethics. Percival was an Englishman, and British medical historian Roy Porter has a very interesting observation to make about the 19th century English world. And I'll read, "The ingrained habits of individuality specific to English liberal politics and the cult of the gentleman that formed the unspoken code of male elites meant that in professional eyes and to a large degree, equally in the public mind, the ethical dilemmas raised by medicine were best handled not by law courts, jurists, academic philosophers, or parliament, but by the integrity of private practitioners following clinical judgment and their own consciousness." Now, this particular historian, I think, is trying to discredit the idea of individuality by locating it as specific to one specific political ideology. But in fact, when you think about it, the tradition of liberal English politics is the basis for the United States Constitution. So I'm going to argue, and you'll see as we go along, that our Code of Ethics is the only medical code compatible with the political ideology that is the foundation of the United States Constitution. I included this quote about the cult of the gentleman. I don't think we need to feel too badly about charges of clubby elitism coming from academic philosophers. So I'm going to skip the next two slides in the interest of time. We're going to jump ahead to an invention of the late 20th century United States. By the late 60s, a new field of ethical inquiry was emerging with a new name. This new name is bioethics. We don't talk about medical ethics anymore. We talk about bioethics. And here's some of the main features, in my view, of bioethics. It's multidisciplinary and it's dominated by non-clinicians. They offer a very robust critique of physician paternalism, but there's no critique at all of the paternalism inherent in many institutional policies. The idea of distributive justice, whatever that is, takes precedence over procedural justice, and the focus shifts from the patient-physician relationship to technology and society. These are not inconsequential developments in ethical theory. Bioethicists also bring in the concept of human rights. More on that later. Now, let's go on to a very big moment in the history of American medical ethics, and I think a lot of you are familiar with this, and many people in this room lived through it. So, in 1975, the Federal Trade Commission filed an administrative complaint against the AMA and 2 smaller medical societies, and the complaint alleged that an ethical prohibition on advertising by physicians amounted to restraint of trade. Now, I found a very interesting article on the FTC website, which I've given you the citation for here, and you do have a handout. And the author says, the commission noted in its complaint that a ban on truthful advertising especially disadvantaged HMOs, an emerging health plan format that needed to advertise precisely because they were unfamiliar to consumers. Well, isn't that interesting? A major motivation for this ruling is to make the world safe for HMOs. So in its zeal to eliminate price fixing by physicians, the FTC ended up laying the groundwork for the biggest price fixing scheme ever in the history of American medicine. Well, the AMA did respond to this FTC ruling. In July 1980, the AMA House of Delegates voted to delete 3 sections from its Code of Ethics. They deleted part of Section 5, a prohibition on soliciting patients. That's the part that you would have thought pertained to the FTC complaint. But they also deleted Section 6, which is an affirmation of the primacy of independent professional judgment, and they eliminated Section 7, an admonition to actively guard against financial influences that could undermine the physician's loyalty to the patient. This change was a response to the FTC ruling. Well, AAPS had a different response to the FTC ruling. Prior to 1980, AAPS had a code for principles of medical practice, which is different than a code of medical ethics, and that related to the practice setting. Prior to 1980, the AAPS used the AMA Code of Ethics. But at the 1980 annual meeting in Louisville, the AAPS Assembly and House of Delegates approved the principles of medical ethics of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. Dan Jordan, who's here in the back of the room, was one of the authors. Henry May was an author, and Robert Sade was an author. You can find Dr. Sade online at his Institute for Human Values in Healthcare. He's affiliated with the Medical University of South Carolina. So we're going to review in just a minute, we're going to review in detail what this meant in 1980 when AAPS adopted its own code of medical ethics. But let's just finish out the story about the AMA and the FTC. By the time the FTC complaint reached the Supreme Court, the AMA was only contesting jurisdictional issues. The case settled in 1982. The Supreme Court split 4-4, so this was not an overwhelming ruling. And this left in place a ruling by the Second Court that barred the AMA from making any prohibitive reference to advertising. Alan Dyer is a psychiatrist and ethicist, and he points out that this ruling by the Second Circuit actually went further than just advertising. The AMA was barred from formulating, adopting, and disseminating any ethical guideline without first obtaining permission from the FTC. Remarkable. All right, now we're going to go through our code of ethics line by line and compare it to the AMA code of ethics. There are other professional societies, there are other codes of ethics. That's beyond the scope of this presentation, so we'll focus on the AMA. I will mention that Physicians for a National Health Plan does not have a code of ethics, but I think we already knew that. Okay, AAPS preamble. The principal objective of the ethical physician in his practice is to treat human illness while maintaining the highest respect for the dignity of the patient. AAPS Principle 1. The physician's first professional obligation is to his patient, then to his profession. His ethical obligation to his community is the same as that of any other citizen. Now compare the AMA Code of Ethics. Principle 7, a physician shall recognize a responsibility to participate in activities contributing to the improvement of the community. Principle 9, a physician shall support access to medical care for all people. This one was added in 2001. AMA changes their code of ethics quite a bit, actually. And then we go on to Principle 8. A physician shall, while caring for a patient, regard responsibility to the patient as paramount. So if you were a patient reading the AMA Code of Ethics, would you know what to expect from your physician? I think if you're a patient reading our Code of Ethics, you would know what to expect, because there is a very clear hierarchy of responsibilities spelled out. Bioethicists are constantly urging physicians to balance priorities. That's one of their favorite words, is balancing. But it turns out in actual practice, when the needs of an individual patient are pitted against the needs of the population always ends up winning out. And I call this mindless utilitarianism. So a central part of my argument is any code of medical ethics that does not unequivocally give first priority to individual patients is, by default, really a population-centered code. Let's go on to AAPS Principle 2. The physician should conduct himself at all times with dignity, integrity, honesty, and diligence. So this provision in our code maintains the classical ethical concept of decorum, which largely disappears from the AMA Code by 1980. Compare and contrast AMA Principle 1. A physician shall be dedicated to providing competent medical care with compassion and respect for human dignity and rights. So here's what I have to say about AMA Principle 1. Competence is not excellence, and humanity is not a person. Okay, AAPS Principle 3. The physician should not condone the taking of human life in the practice of his profession, but at all times respect the sanctity of human life and seek to preserve or improve the quality of life. So our AAPS code is the only code that makes the physician, explicitly makes the physician responsible to respect the sanctity of human life. Right now, our society and our profession are intensely debating the moral legitimacy of physician participation in practices as diverse as abortion, euthanasia, the withdrawal of desired care, organ harvesting, life-threatening research, and pharmacologic executions by the state. In this climate of moral incoherence, Principle 3 in our code gives the physicians clear guidance for his professional conduct. Let's go on to AAPS Principle 4 and AAPS Principle 6. The physician should not dispose of his services under terms or conditions which tend to interfere with or impair the free and complete exercise of his medical judgment. AAPS Principle 6. The physician should limit the source of his professional income to medical services actually rendered by him. He should not receive a commission for referral of patients. The value of professional services should be determined only by mutual agreement between physician and patient, and in no other way. These are Section 6 and Section 7 of the old AMA code that got deleted by the AMA. We made a decision as an organization to keep it. So to put it succinctly, be loyal to your patient. Guard against influences that are going to undermine that loyalty. You heard today about HR 2 and alternative payment models. That's not consistent with AAPS Principle 4 and Principle 6. I've had a direct pay, cash-based fee-for-service practice for the entire 26 years that I've practiced medicine. And the reason I do that is because of Principle 4 and Principle 6. It's true that practicing that way avoids hassle, but the real reason is an ethical reason. AAPS Principle 5. You can read it on the slide there. You're not supposed, don't abandon your patients, and here the AMA code is congruent. Okay, AAPS Principle 7, the physician should personally counsel another practitioner who behaves incompetently or unethically and report persistence of that conduct to the proper authority. AMA Principle 2, a physician shall uphold the standards of professionalism and strive to report physicians deficient in character or competence to appropriate entities. So we have a duty to report, but our code of ethics puts the emphasis on handling differences of opinion collegially, while the AMA code emphasizes reporting and formal disciplinary procedures. And as Larry Huntoon is constantly reminding us, relying on formal disciplinary procedures is quite problematic these days. AAPS Principle 8, the physician should seek advice and consultation with ethical colleagues whenever the quality of medical care may be enhanced or whenever the patient requests it. And Principle 10, the physician should constantly seek factual and reliable information that will assist him in the treatment of illness. Contrast AMA Principle 5. A physician shall continue to study, apply, and advance scientific knowledge, maintain a commitment to medical education, and use the talents of other health professionals when indicated. So, our code puts an explicit emphasis on consultation for the benefit of the individual patient. The AMA code, on the other hand, emphasizes the advance of scientific knowledge, which I think is an idea that's somewhat abstracted from real flesh and blood patients. Notice as well, AMA Principle 5 opens the door wide open for what I call non-physician extenders. AAPS Principle 9, the special importance of the patient's privacy in medical matters requires that the physician should never reveal the confidences entrusted to him, and he should release information only with the consent of the patient and with due consideration of the mandate of law. Compare and contrast AMA Principle 4. A physician shall safeguard patient confidences and privacy within the constraints of the law. I think this is an important difference in wording. So here the AMA Code of Ethics clearly asserts that the law takes precedence over medical ethics. Our code takes into account that the matter of confidentiality, in that matter, medical ethics and the law are often in conflict. Think about HIPAA, think about high-tech. Twyla Brace has educated us a lot about those things. According to the AMA, if the ethics and law conflict, the physician's supposed to defer to the law. According to our code of ethics, if ethics and law conflict in the matter of confidentiality, you should follow the guidance of your conscience. That's an important difference, in my view. AAPS Principle 11, the physician should not solicit patients. So this is the Section 5 that was deleted from the AMA Code. Professional reputation is the major source of patient referral. The physician should be circumspect and restrained in dealing with the communication media, always avoiding self-aggrandizement. The basic idea is to be truthful in representing oneself, and especially don't promise cures. So that's our code of ethics, line by line, 11 principles. Read it often. I'm going to go on to my critique of bioethics. So we have some diversity of ethical thought. There's different ethical theories out there. How's the physician to choose? And I'm going to argue that competing codes of ethics can be evaluated empirically, and I propose two standards, a clinical standard and a standard of conscience. The clinical standard is when the physician's in correct ethical alignment, good clinical outcomes will naturally ensue. This doesn't mean that every patient is cured, but it does mean that suffering is eased and the patient benefits in many ways from the presence of a trusted healer. So one way you can evaluate competing ethical theories is which ethical system produces a better outcome for the individual patient. That's the clinical standard. Standard of conscience. When the physician is in correct ethical alignment, she feels good about her work. The physician who feels demoralized about her work may be getting a signal from her unconscious mind that her ethical stance toward her patients has somehow been compromised. Now, demoralization is not an all or nothing thing. If you feel demoralized, that doesn't mean you're an unethical physician, but it does mean that maybe there is some aspect of your practice that would benefit from reevaluation and soul searching. Now, let's go back to the case. 64-year-old patient with anemia, she'd benefit from IV iron infusion. So what actually happened? This patient offered to pay out of pocket for treatment, but the hematologist who participated in Medicare refused. Symptoms persisted for months until he finally relented and treated her with intramuscular injections of iron. So I believe if AAPS principles 4 and 6 had been followed, the patient would have received the infusion. Straightforward clinical problem solved. A practitioner of bioethics wrestles in his mind with what he perceives to be an ethical dilemma. He feels some regret that treatment's delayed, but he reluctantly accepts that society must find some way to bend the cost curve. Here's my empirical critique of bioethics. The concepts of rights and justice are not intrinsic to the clinical practice of medicine. Rather, these are political concepts that have been grafted onto medical ethics by non-physicians. Human rights. We hear a lot about human rights in medicine these days. Let me quote from Human Rights Watch. They recognize that the right to information, free speech, expression, and assembly are critical means of achieving health. I think we in AAPS would agree with that conception of human rights in medicine. But a legal theory that was specifically designed to protect individuals from torture, degrading and cruel treatment, and denial of due process by the state requires great contortion to fit a medical relationship between two individuals that's based in trust. So I think the concept of human rights applies to the relationship between the patient and the state. It applies to the relationship between the physician and the state. It doesn't apply to the relationship between the patient and the physician. We have a code of ethics that regulates our conduct toward our patients. Justice is another concept designed for the purpose of understanding the relationship of the citizen to the state. We don't have a consensus on the meaning of justice in medicine. Therefore, any attempt by a physician to apply the principle of justice to a clinical decision about an individual patient is merely an exercise in imposing her personal morality onto her patient. Concluding, bioethics is ultimately a population-based approach to medical ethics. Our AAPS Code of Ethics stands alone as a counterweight to an ideology that is too often accepted uncritically by physicians. Every principle in our AAPS code links the physician's actions to his ultimate purpose, which is to promote the welfare of individual patients. Our clinical experience every day validates the patient-centered ethics that are embodied in the principles of medical ethics of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. Oftentimes in our meetings, we talk about these big forces that feel beyond our control. What can we do? Well, one thing we can do is we can follow our own code of ethics as we're treating our patients. And that's a very powerful action. And I'll stop there.
Great.